Donc l'idée là est, disons, on a demandé aux invités de la première session, Paul Appelbaum, Gabor Gombos et Amita Dhanda, de nous faire quelques retours, quelques feedbacks sur ce qu'ils ont entendu, ce qu'ils ont pensé, les réflexions, les questions, les interrogations qu'ils ont pu avoir. Vraiment, en quelques minutes, on vous demande voilà, vos principales remarques. Et je donne la parole à Paul Appelbaum qui doit ensuite nous quitter rapidement. Je vous en remercie.
So my apologies for not being able to stay to the very end, but I'm going to need to leave after I say a few words. So just again by way of background, in contrast to many people here, although I was certainly aware of the convention prior to this conference, and particularly Article 12, it's not something that I had particularly focused on in my work. So I come to the things that I've been hearing here over the last 3 days from a somewhat naive perspective. So there's good and bad in naivete. Sometimes people who are coming fresh to a topic can see it in different ways that are useful. On the other hand, sometimes naivete is simply naivete, and one ends up saying things that are perfectly obvious to the people who've been involved in the process for a long time. But I jotted down a few things that have struck me over the last few days about the convention and its implementation, and I just want to, for what they're worth, share them with you. One is about the premise on which the CRPD is based, namely that, or at least the aspect of it that we're looking at, namely that it is inherently discriminatory to distinguish among citizens in terms of their abilities to exercise rights if one makes that distinction on the basis of mental capacity. So I have a very different view of what constitutes discrimination. I understand discrimination to be treating people differently on the basis of characteristics that are irrelevant to the issue at hand. So if in the United States, we have laws that prohibit in rental of apartments discrimination on the basis of race or national origin or a variety of other protected characteristics, those are irrelevant to whether or not somebody can pay the monthly fee for an apartment. On the other hand, it seems to me mental capacity is not irrelevant to the exercise of tasks, legally operative tasks that require decision-making, and in many respects is the fairest way of making such determinations. So maybe we need to unpack a little bit more what we mean by discrimination in this area. So that's one thought. The second thing that has struck me is that the crafting of Article 12 and the general comment on it in some respects represents an idealistic process that is somewhat detached from reality. Now, maybe all great social reforms have that characteristic. Maybe they're inevitably detached from reality to some extent and focused on their aspirations. But as a psychiatrist, I'm very much embedded in the kind of reality that concerns me most about the implementation of the convention. I'm concerned about the reality of people who, in the grip of acute depression, are suicidal, people who, as a result of psychosis, believe that all their food is poisoned and won't eat, people who, as a result of dementia, are unable to care for themselves, but may not recognize that fact. I believe that a humane society does not allow the suicidal person to kill themselves, the paranoid person to starve to death, or the demented person to wander into the streets and be taken advantage of or hit by a car. We've heard it said in this conference that to focus on those hard cases is perhaps not appropriate because hard cases make bad law, a long-standing maxim. But ignoring hard cases makes bad policy, I think. And it's not clear to me how the CRPD, at least as interpreted according to the general comment, would in fact deal with those issues. And I'm not persuaded that I've heard an answer to that question that satisfies me over the last 3 days. Perhaps the final thing to say is from the perspective of someone who has conducted empirical studies over the years of changes in policies, particularly policies related to mental health and medical care. I'm always aware of the difficulty of anticipating the consequences of a policy change. Something unexpected always happens, which is a reason to think through carefully, as best one can, what the consequences are likely to be, sort of tabletop gaming, worst case analyses, and insofar as possible to experiment with approaches on a small scale before they're implemented more widely. I'm concerned that the big change that's embodied in the convention, or at least, again, the general comment, because I'm not sure, and as we've heard in the course of this conference, the convention can be interpreted, Article 12 can be interpreted in more than one way. That seems to me undeniable, simply because we've heard it over the last 3 days, and the general comment represents one interpretation and perhaps the most radical interpretation. And yet, we've also heard over these last 3 days that although the shift in paradigm is from substitute decision-making to supported decision-making, it's not really clear that anybody has any idea of what supported decision-making actually means or how one does it. Little attention has been given to the questions of who will provide that support, what kind of training they will have, and to the possibilities for undue influence and exploitation on the part of these supporters that are identical to the kinds of abuses that may exist in the current system in which guardians or conservators are appointed. We heard in one of the workshops that I'm sure you'll hear a report from shortly about the potential consequences of Article 12 of the Convention, Articles 12 and 14, for criminal law, abolition of the insanity defense, perhaps the banning of the use of psychiatric disorders as a determinant in dispositions, sending people to prison rather than diverting them to hospitals, consequences that it seems to me have not really been thought through and that are likely to hurt a large number of people. So those are my reflections. Having said all that and standing somewhat outside this, as you know, the United States has not ratified the convention. It will be fascinating to watch what happens. I wish only good things and good outcomes to the countries that are attempting to grapple with these very difficult provisions. But I see reason at least for concern about how it will all unfold.
Merci beaucoup, Paul Appelbaum. Je laisse immédiatement la parole à Amita Dhanda.
I would say that I understand apprehensions. I understand that when you want to bring something new and you want to change the old, there are apprehensions. I also understand that when we displace an order of things because we believe that certain people who possibly should have been consulted or whose voices should have been heard when the order was made were not heard. The entire construction of how to deal with people in distress, or what do we define as distress, what kind of intervention should happen, is largely been constructed without the active involvement of the people who were in distress. There is a certain kind of a sort of, and it's like the way in which we have looked at the whole phenomena of whether it is psychosocial disability or intellectual disability, it has not been a simple kind of progression over a period of time, but it's definitely been progressively, as we have medicalized the understanding of people's condition, it's been progressively as pronouncements you make on the other. You are not in dialogue, you're not in consultation, you're saying, here is a set of people who are different from, need to be acted on, and whether we say that we are doing this as humanitarian impulse, whether we say we are doing it as treatment, whether we say we are, it's like, if you don't intervene, then to that extent, we are being callous. I don't think anyone would sort of have a disagreement to the effect of that, yes, if there is distress, if people need reaching out should happen. The only point or the only question I suppose the new paradigm is raising is that should it be done in this singling out manner? Is it that there is something which if you are behaving in a particular way, or you're thinking in a particular manner, or you're raising some very fundamental kind of questions in that kind of a scenario, should it be that your welfare or what we consider to be good for you should be such that you yourself are nowhere a player? The entire jurisprudence of incompetence in law is primarily a jurisprudence of exclusion. It is a jurisprudence by which you want to give help with whether or not, the person wants it or not, that's one part of it. That's only one part of it. The more important part of it is you do not believe that the person who needs help can seek it and can organize it and can participate in the creation of it. That's the more fundamental kind of query. When we pronounce, that's why the point I have been stressing, and I think in different kinds of ways, in different workshops and interventions, this is common from varied kinds of points of view. The point that one is making is when you say universal legal capacity and universal support, you are at no point saying this, that because you are going to recognize legal capacity, you are hence going to, from here onwards, abandon everybody in need. You are not in any way saying that, okay, irrespective of what you require, we are not interested in. Now, you can sort of like die with your rights on. That is not the point which is being made. In fact, the point which is being made is this, that everybody should have a primarily central space in their own lives, and everyone else should be in support to help that individual person to live the fullest life possible. That's the point which is being made. And the other aspect which is also being said is this, that whether it is, if you're saying universal competence, you're only saying the competence which you are attributing to the society at large must also be extended to persons with disabilities. And the counter side is that the support which people with disabilities seek is as much needed by the rest of humanity and hence should be so constructed for. So you're talking about both universal legal capacity and universal support, and that's the new paradigm. I think this paradigm has an answer for every one of the questions and every one of the apprehensions that Professor Appelbaum has outlined. The only question is that whether, and if it is true that any new change would be seen as idealistic by that which we are familiar with. But reality is only change when, sort of that vision which has come in from people who have experienced the earlier reality are telling us that the way in which we were looking at that earlier reality was foundationally not correct. And I think that is a protest, or that is a dissent, or that is a dialogue, or that is an assertion which has to be accepted. It's an assertion whose time has come. How long we take to accept it would, I suppose, vary from society to society, from place to place. One last point. I agree with Professor Appelbaum that yes, when you're bringing in change, you try as far as be to do these smaller experiments on the side. But the smaller experiments are always experiments of application. The point that one is making is more that when it comes to thought, when it comes to vision, therein there is no question of gradualism. Therein you have to take it as a whole. Thank you so much.
Merci beaucoup. En quelques mots, Gabor Gombos, vos retours sur ce que vous avez un petit peu entendu ici.
Thank you very much. I express my deep regret that the constellations brought us into a situation that neither in the opening session nor now in this coming to the closing part, we have a real opportunity to dialogue with Professor Appelbaum. It's a very unfortunate situation. He made quite critical statements about the general comment as a naive layman from the human rights perspective. I do not feel the competence to criticize psychiatry as a profession. As a person, I could do that, but this is not the right place for that. Yes, Professor Appelbaum is absolutely right that those things which he mentioned were voiced in these 3 days. But the opposite things were also voiced. And not only by some of the radical people. I found it very interesting to hear from young, emerging, leading, hopefully, psychiatrists saying that locked ward makes no sense, and actually it makes situations, in fact, worse. I heard from another professional saying that if the future is for me to fill forms and use checklists, it is not going to be a good future. Looks like that the same profession is not speaking in one voice, which I think is a great news. 20 years ago, when some of us raised in conferences the issue that, for instance, unconsented treatment can be torture, we were immediately ruled out. A chief psychiatrist arrived and told us that, shut up, well, in a more courteous way, but in effect the same. You are not competent to say such things. You are ill. You have some confusion here. Now, people often have skepticism about the power of human rights. And yes, human rights does not have any enforcement mechanisms like courts do have. But human rights is not law. Human rights is much more than law. Human rights is primarily about humanity and not about rules. Rules are created based on humanity, not the other way around. That's a very different perspective, I think. It was interesting to hear law colleagues talking about the same thing in very different perspectives, which is again great. These perspectives are there. Each of them is valid. We need to have a discourse. Now we are in a university. Now it was not only us, it was many of you who spoke about the very same things 20 years ago. Some radical survivors of psychiatry raised and were disqualified from the discourse. Even in the human rights discourse, we were often disqualified, until very recently. I am increasingly optimistic. Human rights has power. The discourse is no longer discredited. It's no longer discreditable. It happens in a mainstream fora, and it's not happening solely by users and survivors of psychiatry. For me, what happened in these 3 days clearly gives a very strong conviction that assessing mental capacity really makes no sense from a human rights perspective. Why? Because the same profession had very conflicting views about its value, and the very same thing. Mats asked the question again, because of time issues, we had no opportunity to answer it. Mats on the first day asked the question, how is it that in Sweden no one raises the issue to assess the voting capacity of a person? At the same time, in the US, in some states, and in France, and in Hungary, it is a very important issue. Well, now for me, this situation, which we also heard today in the workshop, that really in different countries, the legislation and the policy is very different on that regard. This gives me an evidence that in the general comment, the committee was absolutely right when it said that mental capacity is not an objective thing, not a scientific thing, which comes by nature. It is a socio-political, economic, and cultural construct. And then that's about its objectivity. I am open to become convinced that I am wrong, but I haven't heard any strong argument in favor of having an objective nature to assessing mental capacity as such, having something to do with legal capacity. Finally, I think that we had gone through very intensive, sometimes emotionally heated discussions, deliberations in the ad hoc committee, those of us who participated in the negotiations of the convention. And even at that time, I think we noticed or predicted that we have to have the same discourses in the national arenas. It cannot be prevented. Just the fact that, you know, on the top the UN agreed in something, you can read this way, you can read that way, international human rights law does not directly apply. Domestically, there are all these issues which are right. But what certainly the CRPD increasingly is doing in more and more countries and societies and communities is that these discourses are actually taking place. And this conference was primarily about that for me. So the CRPD has already made a huge change in the discourse level. Now we have to focus on the practicalities while continuing the discourse, learning how different countries, different societies try to respond to general comment number 1, for instance, and then the committee will be in the position to reflect on the various efforts, and we will learn more and more about how to do things right. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Gabor Gombos.